Hi, everyone. My name is Josh Acklin, and I am the co-chair of March for Science New York City. And I'm really excited today to introduce this panel on composting and composting infrastructure in New York City. So with that, I'm going to introduce Nathan and Meredith. Nathan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Nathan Bartholomew. I'm the Director of Horticulture for Domino Park. I oversee all the park plantings, horticulture, as well as the compost operation here.
Great, thanks for joining us. Meredith?
Yeah, hi, I'm Meredith Danberg-Ficarelli. I'm the Executive Director of Common Ground Compost. We are a zero waste services company based in the city. We do zero waste consulting. We work with zero waste events. We are an education and advocacy organization. We have a bicycle-powered organics microhauling operation called Reclaimed Organics. And we are currently launching a digital waste management platform software called Watts to help with organizing and improving efficiency in the waste industry.
Very cool. Can you, Meredith, explain what zero waste means?
Sure. So zero waste, as defined by the Zero Waste International Alliance, or ZWIA, it's a concept around resource conservation. This idea that it is our responsibility as humans to recover as much value from materials as we can. Everything is made of something, and everything has some value in that it was made from something. And this might look like redesigning some products and potentially phasing out the use of some materials that are particularly expensive, hard to recover, particularly harmful, both to the environment and to people who have to handle them, while also really incentivizing the development of infrastructure to improve access to recycling and waste diversion programs, with the goal of reducing the burning of waste, so incineration, and reducing discharges of waste to land, air, and water. So land, we traditionally think of as landfilling. Air, we could also consider kind of the toxic outputs of burning waste and other activities. Microplastics especially are in the air, and that counts. And water, of course, we can think of the Pacific garbage patch, pollution in waterways as that. And one other way that we can think of zero waste is as the diversion of more than 90% of our waste from landfills or incinerators. That's kind of another way that it's thought of, is that it's like 10% or less goes into a black trash bag, and everything else has a place to go where it can be recovered or otherwise diverted.
Yeah, and so Nathan, coming from Domino Park, when we talk about where waste ends up going, how would you say most parks in a place like New York City, that's an island, very difficult to get to large plots of land, how do we deal with waste?
Yeah, so I can speak on behalf of the Domino Park. Early on in our development, sustainability and resiliency were big goals, and so composting kind of naturally fell into that. So when the city abruptly halted their composting initiative as a cost-saving measure for COVID, many residents were not happy with that, including our local community. And so that was May 2020, and so we decided to take action and respond to that by providing a public food scrap drop-off site, and we were able to kind of get that going very quickly, June 2020, because we did have some infrastructure in place. We were composting on a commercial level with local restaurants, as well as community partners such as the North Brooklyn Angels, Lasaurus Food Pantry. And so we did have the infrastructure in place to transition over. With parks, what we have here is we have organic debris, right? One of the components you need that carbon component in order to compost. So parks are a natural place to compost. All you have to do is get those food scraps and the wood chips or the organic material, leaf debris from the park spaces together. And you can compost almost anywhere on a small scale, whether you have a parking space, an 8x5 parking space to luckily, we have a 5-acre park here that we're able to dedicate some space to our sustainability initiatives. And so, that's kind of how we kind of got started with composting.
Right. Yeah. So I know that there, like pre-COVID, there was this push to use kind of a centralized approach towards composting for the city at large. Trying to transition organic material away from landfills and towards a centralized composting site, which would then deliver to green spaces for fertilizer and things like that. And is that the program you're talking about being cut pre-COVID, the delivery of compost to parks?
Yes, well, I'm specifically talking about the brown bin system for residents that was cut. So our program was a direct response to that.
I see. And so I think a lot of groups nowadays are starting to think of this kind of decentralized approach to the climate crisis, where we, build a lot of this infrastructure in our local communities. One major problem that at least I've heard about through my interactions with Madison Square Park has been, when you generate so much compost at a site like a park, do you ever generate too much? And, what do you do with all of the excess compost?
So just to give you some metrics on our system. So first year, 2020, we diverted 54 tons of material from the waste stream, from the landfill, and we created compost locally on site. We were able to return almost half of that, I think, back to the community through local gardens. If you dropped off food scraps, you could take compost home with you for your personal garden. And so I think, on a small, decentralized, local scale, these things can work. So we're able to distribute that compost back to the community locally from which it came. So it's a full circle.
Right. And I mean, that sounds amazing. But Meredith, as you mentioned with infrastructure, who pays to take this away to the local gardens? Is there a city service, or is this something that the park kind of coordinates? And Meredith, can you talk a little bit about the advocacy work you've done around kind of building infrastructure for residential and like community composting?
Sure. I'd actually love to hear Nathan say whether people came with tote bags. How were they collecting the finished compost to bring back?
Yeah, great question, Meredith. So it was amazing, the response. So, on any given session, we offer twice a week, Monday and Thursday, people can come drop off food scraps and take compost home. People were washing their bins out, and they were literally putting the finished compost right in the bin that they had brought their food scraps in, buckets, bags. We offered paper bags as well, eco-friendly bags for people to fill up and bring back to their site. And we definitely had some of the bike trailers, and people were just taking it in any way they possibly could back to their gardens.
Compost is magical. I mean, one point I'll make is that our city soils are incredibly depleted, as are our agricultural soils. Honestly, I think it's going to be a long time before we have too much compost. Yes, absolutely. If one particular generator has all of it and can't do anything with it, absolutely. And there's certainly a challenge right now at kind of even the largest scale of compost manufacturing, of making sure that farmers are educated about the value of organic matter, and also about what conventional agriculture has done to our soil quality over, let's say, less than even the last 100 years, but especially since kind of our industrial approach to agriculture began. We're continuously depleting our soils of a significant diversity of nutrients and minerals and all kinds of other things. And food scraps composted, then the compost applied is one way to start to rebuild our soils, the biodiversity and the moisture retention and all of these things that are important. On the advocacy side, in terms of New York City's particular situation, I can just quickly explain, COVID was really hard. We run a bicycle powered pickup program, as I mentioned, and we made the excellent decision in 2018 and 2019 to pivot our services and focus on offices and collect from offices and do consulting work in offices and waste audits and concierge, like white glove services. And that was great until the whole economy shut down for almost 2 years. And we're just now starting to see some of those offices come back. So it's been really hard. And, we had to pivot our approach, and especially kind of in early lockdown and through the entire first year of the pandemic, we launched a drop-off on the Upper West Side, which is pretty far from our headquarters, which is in the East Village, because we recognize that our own bike collection program, which was a fee for service to collect from residents, only went to a certain point in Manhattan, and there are plenty of other residents. And there at that time weren't any drop-off opportunities, in that particular part of the Upper West Side where we went. So we ran that drop-off for a year, which was great. I believe I just saw the statistics today. I think over time we diverted about 20 tons of material from that drop-off. Through our program, since its inception in 2014, we've diverted just over 350 tons of food scraps from landfills and incinerators. And the Save Our Compost coalition or initiative is a grassroots collection of individuals, nonprofit organizations, small businesses that got together right when the city initially defunded the organic mentioned earlier, and it's still active today, bringing together petitions, participating in public hearings, trying to increase, actually, claw back funding that used to exist for the residential organics recycling initiatives that exist, both funded nonprofit organizations and actual city collections.
Yeah, so I guess that kind of brings me to my next point. Mayor Adams, he's proposed a budget that will be discussed soon in front of City Hall. So I wanted to ask you, Meredith, what are some pieces of infrastructure that you think we need to be investing in now so that we can actually begin to rebuild this residential composting system?
Rebuild or build?
Rebuild or build?
Yeah. So we need every scale of solution. We need everything from individual residents working with their kids to use worms to do vermicomposting under their sinks in bins. We're not talking about worms crawling all over the house. Bokashi fermentation composting, small scale, anyone that has a backyard potentially doing some of their own or neighborhood-based composting, community gardens, small scale regional facilities, nonprofit organizations, and ideally for-profit or worker-owned cooperative style operations doing small to medium scale, community scale composting, regional facilities. And we're gonna also need these kind of much larger scale, multi-regional, mega regional, whatever you want to call them. We need every single, we need more infrastructure, many times more infrastructure than we have now at every single level there. And there are many ways to recycle organic matter that we're not currently using. We're talking about composting, but even in New York City, a good portion of our food scraps end up in anaerobic digestion facilities, one in particular at Newtown Creek. And there are major efficiencies there because the distance traveled is shorter than in alternative cases. But if there's no methane capture happening, and if we're not actually generating energy, and if we're not sending the solid byproduct, the digestate, from that anaerobic digestion process to be composted, we're still just flaring methane and sending food scraps to landfills. So, without significant systems change here, recognizing that politics needs to get as much with the program as billionaires do, we need a lot of money to be able to build the infrastructure that we need to do this. And it's not just about waste. We need a lot of infrastructure in a lot of different sectors to build the economy that we need, within the next 8 years, to try to mitigate some of the biggest impacts of climate change.
Right. Perhaps instead of investing in things like, say, the NYPD, we could be investing in, composting infrastructure and methane capture. And actually, that's where I wanted to go next, was methane capture. So I don't think a lot of people know about this, but in anaerobic reactors, right, you produce methane that can then be used as fuel in an exchange for natural gas, for example. Can you explain why that's a net zero solution? Or approaching net zero?
Sure. There are plenty of people who will be able to explain this better than me, but I'll do my best. So when we think of natural gas, we're talking about methane. Natural gas is being fracked right now by the fossil fuel industry, and it's being piped. Natural gas, it is methane. It's the same thing, and there are massive negative impacts to the environment and to the communities where that's based, and all kinds of things about fracking. We're making plastics out of byproducts from fracking right now because the fossil fuel industry is subsidized by the government. That is offsetting or tipping the scales for what the recycling economy could be able to provide. And I know this is not answering your question, but I can't help it. In terms of methane capture from organics recycling, the really short version is methane on its own ending up in the environment is more potent than carbon dioxide in terms of its warming potential. So it contributes faster and more to the greenhouse effect and to global warming. What we can do is capture that, scrub it, and engineers and other folks will be able to explain that much better than I can. And so essentially, if we're able to use methane that's produced in the anaerobic digestion process and use it for energy, we're not only recycling organic matter and keeping it local because these AD facilities are usually closer, reducing the transit impacts of the organic waste, which is the heaviest and wettest portion of the waste stream, therefore the most expensive to transport. We are also avoiding the emissions that would be associated with the energy production from using other fossil fuel alternatives or whatever other alternatives we have for producing energy. Right, so there's the dual benefit of recycling the organic matter and producing a byproduct that then displaces a different use or a different requirement rather for natural resources for energy.
Right. I think what I found confusing when I first heard about this concept was this idea, okay, so we're exchanging, one source of methane for another source of methane. How is this a net zero solution? But I think what people don't realize is that when this food waste goes into the landfill, we're producing this methane gas anyway, right? They're just not capturing it. So instead of actually fracking for natural gas here, we're actually, using our composting systems to generate the methane that would already be generated, capture it and use it for energy. So that'll also,
yeah, and ideally making even more methane
right.
for capture, right? If we can divert more organics through that process. And landfills are far away. So we're talking about significant transit emissions to get organics to far-flung landfills in order to produce methane there. Yeah.
Yeah, and so Nathan, that brings me back to Domino Park. You guys, do you have an aerobic or an anaerobic reactor?
So we have a aerobic digester. We have the Rocket A900. It's about a 500-gallon machine. And the great thing about it is you can continually add to it. So we can add 3-5 times a day. And it's an automated system, which saves us on operation and labor costs as well. It also is stainless steel vessel, so it's completely contained. It's the odor is mitigated, the rats are mitigated. All these things are contained, and we love it because of those factors, and also the ability to continually add to the system versus making a batch compost or a windrose pile, which you need substantial material to start.
Gotcha. So is that kind of one way in which Domino Park made it affordable to actually build your own reactor? Or, I know that these are quite expensive to do on the large scale. So I'm curious how you managed to secure one.
Yeah, so, luckily we're backed by a parent company, Two Trees Management. And, sustainability and composting was a big priority. So we were able to get a little over a 6-figure investment to roll out this rocket component of the program.
Gotcha. Yeah, and so Meredith, in terms of at-home composting or even this kind of decentralized community composting, do you envision this being a more efficient process if we do use an anaerobic reactor and capture methane to, say, heat buildings? Or do you think it will be more efficient to invest in a lot of aerobic reactors that may be easier to distribute those things?
I want to see all of it.
Yeah.
Give me a magic wand and a blank check, and we'll work with all of our local allies. So it's a complicated question in New York City because our buildings don't currently have space allocated for storage of waste in the first place, which is why New York City so gloriously is always just covered with garbage bags. If anybody's ever walked down a street in New York, they'll probably have seen piles of black bags and clear bags and cardboard, and probably rats ripping open black bags, because it's really easy for them to get to food when it's in a trash bag, harder for them to get to food when it's in a compost bin. So I think part of this could be a reconsideration. Maybe it's some kind of a rebate program for buildings that are willing to install infrastructure. Because organics are so heavy and wet and expensive to transport, I think it would be great to be able to process some portion of our organic waste stream within buildings before it even leaves the site, or in a hub and spoke model, maybe within small neighborhood-based regions. I think consolidation is going to be really important. So maybe it's using micro haulers to bring material to a centralized facility. Maybe we're talking a 10 or 20 block radius. We're not talking about huge areas, so that material can either be processed there or then picked up by a hauler, which is one of the models that we use in our micro hauling operation.
Yeah.
I think regulations are a big question here. So I know that it can be challenging to get anaerobic digesters cited because methane is scary. It is explosive, so I understand why. But there are ways to manage these things safely, and models have already been proven elsewhere, and we really need to catch up. And I think that the potential benefits that just looking at hauling costs reduction, but of course also considering the carbon footprint reduction, the potential for small businesses, minority and women-owned entities to be able to step in as service providers in a lot of these areas, not just as micro haulers, but as the ones maintaining and operating the machines, auditing waste streams to educate folks about diversion opportunities and contamination. There's so much growth potential in the waste management economy, even if you just look in New York City.
Yeah, thank you. That's amazing. So I think we're out of time here. So what I'd like to do is just ask some closing thoughts from each of you before we close this. Nathan?
Yeah, so let's face it, New York City needs a mandated citywide program in order to do this. Looking at their $30 million budget, the program failed. They only diverted 1.4%. And the main reason for this was because the high cost was these inefficient routes, and it was inefficient routes. Hauling cost was like the main factor why it failed. And so these smaller scale sites were, and then just returning that material to the local community is much more easier to implement and cheaper as well than, let's say, some of these larger methane collecting systems or larger programs.
Yeah, exactly. Meredith?
Education. In addition to all of these things, people need more information, and it needs to be given to them in their language, and from a perspective that makes it important to them. Some people really care about economics. Other people want to know that their kids are going to be safe and that trucks aren't going to be speeding down their streets. And the city does not have a budget for that right now, to educate people about why organics recycling matters, how it's going to impact their daily lives, how they'll have to take out the trash less frequently, who's actually doing the work of organics recycling, how it can improve our environment. And we need to respect people and recognizing that they want this information. Waste is very opaque. Waste infrastructure costs. Most people don't know where their trash goes, why it's expensive. And I think that we need to give them the benefit of the doubt that they want that information. And it's our experience that whenever we're educating folks about waste systems, they're always in awe because they've never heard this stuff before. And there needs to be, if we're going to be investing in infrastructure, which I think Nathan and I have both made abundantly clear is really important, we also really need to recognize the importance of educating people about why we're making these expenditures, and how their own individual actions and community actions fit into the puzzle.
Yeah, I mean, something we found at March for Science through a lot of our webinars and conversations with other, community groups is that a lot of times these issues kind of get oversimplified to the point where we don't trust people to actually understand the material that they need to understand to make these informed decisions and advocate for these kinds of things.